Hello, everybody. And today I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Joe. That's Dr. Joseph Nowinski, who is a clinical psychologist and is very much renowned internationally for the work that he has done with people with addictions. And he has written one of his most notable books is Recovery After Rehab. And today we're going to talk about his new book that's just come out, hopefully that's something called Sober Love, which, as Dr. Joe says, is actually a love book, which I just thought, Joe, was a lovely way to explain what your book is. And as you read it, I think you understand that's what it's about. It's about people's relationship.
That's correct. Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here, by the way. Yeah, the book, the subtitle is How to Stop Drinking as a Couple. So in a sense, you can say, well, it's a book about drinking. It is, but it's a book about much more than drinking. It's really a book about relationships. Most of my work over the years, and I've had a pretty extensive experience, I guess you could say, in treating substance abuse disorders, was focused on individuals. I mean, that's what we've done for a long time. We've focused our attention on individuals, men and women, who had a drinking problem or a substance abuse problem, and how to help them. But I was aware over the years that there was very little focus on couples. You know, was it true that everybody who came into treatment or came into my office, they had a drinking problem and that was it? There's nothing to do with their relationship. Their partner didn't have a drinking problem. And as I begin to invite those people, well, first of all, I'd ask them, does your partner drink as well? And if they said no, then I said, well, fine, we can work on you. But if they said, yes, my partner does drink, I would say, how would you feel about inviting your partner in and we can talk about your drinking together? Okay. And so that's where the theme of the book comes in. The book is about drinking, but it's about much more than drinking. It's about your relationship. It's about how uh, drinking has affected your relationship and about love to the extent that how much do you not only do we love ourselves, but how much do we love our relationship?
Mm.
How important is it to us, our relationship? Because people would often say to their partner, well, you have the problem, I don't. So it's your problem, I don't. I don't have to do anything, I don't have to stop. But what that does is it begs the question of your relationship. You know, has drinking affected your relationship? How much do you care about? How much do you love your relationship? And so my starting point was to have couples look at that and say, well, tell me about your relationship when you first got together. What was it like? What were the things that brought you together? Uh, and they talk about physical attraction, of course. But I said, well, what about personalities? What about the other person's personality that you were attracted to? And they'd always talk about something like, oh, I love the sense of humor. I love the fact that this person was curious. I love their sense of adventure. We shared a lot of activities. We had shared goals and shared interests. We had shared friends and friendships. And I said, see, well, that was your relationship. You built that relationship. And that's like a third thing between you. There's one person, the other person, then there's relationship. And then I say, let's take a look at how has drinking affected that relationship. And that's where the starting point of the book is, because usually when they looked at it, they would find that it did affect the relationship. All right. And I point out the fact that we live in a drinking culture, certainly here in the US, you in the UK. We live in a culture where drinking is considered normal and it's very much encouraged. And we know that there's a lot of people who suffer from drinking problems. It affects us as individuals in terms of our health, for example. Um, but it's not an all or none thing. It's not either you're an alcoholic or you're not. Uh, Drinking exists. I talk in the book on a spectrum from kind of mild or low risk drinking up through a mild, moderate, and even severe abuse. But not everybody gets to that point of severe alcohol abuse. A lot of people, they're not they're not low risk drinkers either. They're someplace in the middle. So they drink more than is good for them. They drink in a way that affects them individually. They may not notice it, but it will affect their health. For example, they may not sleep as well. They may gain weight. They may feel less energy, and it affects their relationship. They don't do things together that they used to do. Uh, for
When
example,
I was going to say, sorry, when you have people that come in, they to talk, they must find it quite a revelation that they're not there. I mean, obviously you're going to talk about their drinking, but you're there to talk about their relationship and the effect that alcohol has the relationship. So it immediately sort of changes the spotlight away from the actual drinking and makes
mhm,
people think, well, if I'm not, you know, how your life can improve as opposed to, oh, let's just stop drinking. It's more about what you're going to gain. And I thought
exactly.
that's far more motivational for a couple in particular to work together.
I agree. That's what I found as well. Once people are willing to engage in a conversation about drinking, not just about drinking, but their relationship and how has it changed over time, it opens the door to that possibility that maybe things could be better.
Mm,
And so I raised this issue, this question or this choice. I said, you know, in our culture, you could choose to be a drinking couple. You could be a drinking couple. But now when we talked about it, you see how drinking has affected your relationship. Well, you have a choice. You could choose to identify yourself as a drinking couple, which is common, or you could take a risk and identify yourself as a sober couple. Maybe you want to consider being a sober couple. And as you just said, and what do you stand to gain by that? What do you stand to gain individually? What do you stand to gain in terms of your relationship? And you're right, it changes the whole topic of the conversation from
mm,
just one person has a drinking problem to we have an opportunity to improve ourselves individually and what do we stand to gain as a relationship.
mm,
And there are many examples in the book of couples who have done just that.
mm. That's what I was going to say, that I like that all the way through the book, you give examples and stories of couples that allows people to relate, but obviously the stories are all different. So, but there's a bit, probably a bit of each story, each one of us can also understand as well. And I think it's really interesting how you say that it's one of those things that you don't realize how it sneaks up on you.
Right,
And as you mentioned earlier, you have a diagram to show how people start and how just a couple of drinks leads on. And
right.
at that point, you don't realize what is happening as time goes by, because as you say, it happens very, very slowly.
It happens slowly, and our culture encourages it. You know, you see it all over in the
Mm,
media about drinking, and so it's very easy for, say, a woman to meet friends on a Friday happy hour and have one cocktail, and then go home, and then but a few months later, she's meeting friends and she's having two cocktails. Okay, and then she goes home and maybe has a third cocktail, and she may not realize consciously how that's changing. She may not, and couples together, they may decide that on a weekend they have one drink together, a glass of wine, and but then over time it becomes two or three glasses of wine. It happens slowly, and so that's the way alcohol progresses, and people may not realize it, but most importantly, they may not realize how it's affecting them.
mm,
Okay, so they may not realize that they don't sleep as well now as they did a year ago. They wake up at night and they can't get back to sleep. And the next day, they don't have as much energy. And that translates into their relationship. Okay. So that they get home from work together and they have two or three drinks and they get tired and they no longer spend time talking. They don't say play a game together. Uh, they don't plan to go out together. Things they used to do. Maybe they used to go out to eat twice a week. Now they don't do that anymore. They used to go out to the theater once a month. Now they don't do that anymore. So you're right, there's a very slow progression. And again, the focus of the book is not just on your drinking, but how much do you care about that relationship?
Mm.
And how much do you think it could improve? And how much have you lost? But you're absolutely right that it sneaks up on you. It's not something that people simply cross from one boundary to another. They slip into it. They may not be aware of it, except if they stop and pause and think about it.
Mm. And I think one of the things I found very shocking, it made me think, oh gosh, is when you said you started mentioning children and the
Mhm.
impact that it has on the family, and
Yes.
talking about the time that's then taken away, and how drinking becomes something that you actually have to devote time to.
Mhm. I think that's you're making a very important point that I make in the book as well, that it's to some extent you say it's a book about relationship, but it's also a book about family, especially if
Mm,
you have children. Because I asked them to, if they do have children, not only has drinking and where are you on the spectrum and how has it affected your relationship, but if you have children, how has it affected your family? Invariably, they may say, well, how much time do you spend talking to your children? How much time do you spend supervising their homework? How much time do you spend having meals together? How much time do you spend doing things together? And what they will usually find is that, well, again, they may not be at the same place on the drinking spectrum. One may be more severe than the other, but that still affects their family life,
mm,
so that they don't spend as much time with their kids. They may find that that a child's not doing as well in school, whereas they used to spend time, say, playing a game with their children, they don't do that so much anymore.
mm.
Okay.
When people come to you, do, do people generally come as an individual, or do they come as a couple? Do they recognize it as being a couple thing, or is it generally an individual that then goes, oh, actually, maybe it's both of us?
Unfortunately, it's been almost always as an individual.
Yeah.
Although sometimes that individual comes to me or comes to the treatment because they're pressured by somebody else. They're pressured by a partner who says, either you stop drinking or I'm getting a divorce. Okay. Or something like that, that they feel some pressure from outside. They may get into trouble at the workplace, and they get in trouble for having drinking on the workplace, and they're told you have to get help. So they may be pressured, but they're coming in for themselves. And or very often the person who's their partner, I hate to say this way, but gets off the hook because they don't
Mm,
really have to look at their own drinking. And they say, well, it's your problem, not my problem. So very seldom. But the whole point of the book is not just about that individual, it's about the relationship, and by extension about your family. And how does your family stand to gain if you become a sober couple? Things happen, change as a couple gets more into drinking. What they find is their kids, uh, they get isolated more.
mm,
They spend more time in their room alone.
mm.
They don't interact with their parents. They don't invite friends over to visit uh, because they're aware of their parents drinking, even
Yeah,
if their parents are not.
and that's one of the things that, sort of brought me up short when I read that. And we've done quite a few chats around trauma. And obviously, for a lot of people, trauma comes out when they're an adult. That's when you see the real consequences.
Right,
And there's, various things, whether people have been abused, whether a parent has been ill, or whether there's alcohol in the
right,
family.
right,
And, it causes so many problems, I think, for people not, and as you said, we're not talking about the people who are the out and out, what we would have called alcoholics, where,
right.
you think, but we're talking about the people that are, I suppose, functioning, thinking they're fine, but they're not really.
Right, because they don't take a look, they don't
Yeah.
take a closer look. And your point is well taken. In the beginning of the book, my chapter is Why We Drink. I point out that there's many different reasons why people do turn to drink. Okay. Uh, First of all, we do live in a drinking culture, which encourages it, even among teenagers, it encourages them to drink. But there's other reasons. There's trauma. People who experience trauma, abuse, or neglect, they may
Mm,
often turn to drink to compensate for that.
mm,
Okay. They may live in a family culture where drinking is very prevalent, where their parents drink, where their extended families drink. So there may be, reasons like in older people in our culture, isolation and loneliness contributes to drinking because they spend so much time alone, and so they drink as a way of compensating. So my point is that there may be many different reasons why people start drinking, and that's legitimate. But once you get into a relationship, okay, and you begin to form that relationship, the point of the book is that it's more than just about the drinking. There may be a lot of reasons why you started drinking, and even why you drink more than you used to. But the point is stop and look at this relationship that you have and that you valued when you got together, and what made up that relationship. When you started a family, what made up the family? How much time did you spend parenting and being involved together as a family? And how has that changed over time as a result of drinking that you haven't been willing to recognize? And then the book basically goes through a lot of issues that couples are going to confront, like how do you change your lifestyle? Uh, so if they come to that critical point that I pointed out, that they decide, well, maybe we should think about becoming a sober couple instead of being a drinking couple. Maybe we stand to gain by that. Maybe our relationship could get better. Maybe our family could get better. And as you say, that's motivating. Not just
mm,
that I have a problem, but how could our lives get better? Then they have to face the issues that they're going to confront. So it's one thing to have an intention, okay, to say, okay, we want to become a sober couple, but then it has to be followed by a lot of action, and that's where the book comes in. You have to build a sober lifestyle, okay, and that can take some work.
mm,
Um, and it can be starting by just how, as one couple who were attorneys talked to me. They were attorneys, and they lived in a culture where there was a lot of drinking, and they realized that drinking had affected their relationship, and it had been hollowed out. They really didn't have much. They didn't do much of anything together anymore that they used to do. And so they said, well, okay, we're willing to become a sober couple. And I said, well, it's going to start by telling all your friends that you're going to be sober. And so they realized that could be a challenge. How are they going to tell all their drinking friends that they're now going to be sober? And it was funny because one of them quipped, says, well, I told them we were coming out of the closet from drinking. And they found that a humorous way to say they're going to be a sober couple, because at one point they came out of the closet as being gay, and now they were going to come out of the closet as being sober. And I talk with people about, they often are afraid of that. And I say, look, if your friends are true friends and you just tell them that you both decided to stop drinking, uh, the chances are, if they're friends, they're not going to give you a problem with that.
mm,
Uh, in fact, what they may discover, as you said at the outset, is that there's a time in many people's lives when they drank much more. And there are many people out there now who are choosing to be sober because for health reasons,
mm,
because they really think that their lives, in terms of their health, their lifestyle, is better being sober. And so I think that's a sort of a turning point in society where there's more and more people who are willing to consider becoming a sober person. Well, I think there's more and more couples who are willing to consider being a sober couple.
mm.
So it begins with sort of, I guess, coming out of the closet. Then it progresses to having to change your lifestyle, because what happens is that as time goes on, a couple's lifestyle begins to accommodate drinking.
Yeah. Oh, it becomes your lifestyle.
It's exactly right. It becomes your lifestyle. If they look around your house, how much of your house is accommodating drinking?
Yeah.
Your wine racks, your wine glasses, your cocktail glasses, your bar, even your furniture. The furniture you sit in and drink. Um, and then there's your daily routines, that you follow. We all have routines from the time we get up till the time we go to bed. We all have, but then drinking becomes routine too.
Mm.
So I ask people, part of my work with them is let's look at starting with your physical environment. What's going to have to change? You're going to have to get rid of all the liquor. If you have a bar, you're probably going to have to convert it to a bookcase. You're going to have to give away your wine rack. Um, you may have to change your furniture. You may have to move it around, or if you have a couch that you two sit in and drink, maybe you're going to have to move that couch, or maybe you're going to even have to get a different couch so that you change your environment to make it more conducive to being sober.
Mm.
And, that takes some hard work. You may have to change routines. Uh, if the first thing you're used to doing when you got home was having a glass of wine together, maybe you're going to have to think about something like maybe take a little stroll around the block together. One couple decided that they're going to meditate together. They took up a class of meditation, and 3 times a week they met at the meditation class, and they developed a habit of meditating. And eventually, their routine changed from coming home and drinking to coming home and meditating.
Mm.
So those may seem like little things, but they're very important, because if you don't make those changes, the chances are you're going to slip back into drinking again.
Well, it's breaking the habit, isn't it? Because a lot of it is
Sure.
habit and mindless drinking. Because I'm sure that if you speak to a lot of people, if they drink heavily, it's like, or it's even smoking, isn't it? They don't notice half of what they've consumed or
Right.
taken.
Right. They don't realize that they've developed not only a relationship with each other, but they each have developed a relationship with drinking.
Mm.
You know, as the old saying goes, drinking is my friend.
Mm.
You know, uh, whatever reason started them from drinking, they come home from work and they want to have a drink because it relaxes them. Well, what they're also saying is drinking, they have a relationship with drinking.
Mm.
And that relationship competes with their relationship with each other.
So,
So
but when people come, I mean, I suppose everybody and every couple is different, but do you go through all of the different things about what they, starting with their relationship and then moving on to habits? At what point do you ever ask them to stop drinking, or do you make sure that you establish good foundations of understanding what they feel they're going to gain?
I think what you said is very important. I think it has to begin with making a decision. And I talk about what it takes to make a decision to become a sober couple. First
Right.
of all, it takes commitment. Are you willing to commit to it? And I talk about research about, what are called, resilient people. And people who are resilient are able to make a commitment, not half-hearted. I tell them, it's not going to help you decide to drink for 1 week. You know, if drinking has no, as you pointed out, your lifestyle has come to accommodate drinking. You have a drinking lifestyle, and making a change in a lifestyle is different. It takes time. It takes commitment. If you want to become in better physical condition, you can't just say, "Well, I'm going to exercise for 1 month, and I'm going to be in better physical condition." You know, if I want to lose weight, I can't just change my diet for 1 week. That's half-hearted. And it's true. I asked them to think about it as a couple and how much are they committed to making this change? Uh, how much are they willing to accept the fact that they are going to have to make changes? And I asked them to think about that. Uh, and say if one person's problem is worse than the other, I say, well, the one whose problem isn't as bad, do you still you still stand to gain by becoming a sober couple. Even if your partner's problem is worse, if you work on being sober together, do you also still stand to gain and your family? And I ask them to, sometimes I say, go home and think about that,
Mm.
and talk about it because, it's important for you to make that decision. And then if they say, yeah, we're ready, then I go to the next step, which is your lifestyle. Let's look at your lifestyle. What kind of changes are you going to have to make? You know, and jokingly, for example, maybe converting the bar to a bookcase.
Yeah.
How, you know, um, things like that. Where do you drink? What's your routine? What's the first thing you do when you get home? How could you change that together? Again, not the old thing about just how the individual has changed, but what can you do together that's going to revitalize this relationship? And then you have to move on to very other important issues like intimacy. You know, how has that changed over time? How much time do you spend talking together? How much time do you spend intimately talking together about your lives, about what you're thinking, or versus just drinking and not talking? Okay. How much time do you share doing things together that you used to do? Some couples say, well, used to like to play a board game or do a puzzle. Well, I say, well, when's the last time you played a board game? And unfortunately, they'll often say, I can't remember the last time we did that.
Mm.
Uh, for some couples, going out for dinner once a week used to be a shared pleasure. And I say, how much do you do that now? And they'll say, we don't do that very much anymore. And then there's also sexual intimacy. What did that look like in the beginning of your relationship? And what's it like now? Has it changed? Has it diminished? Is it less satisfying? A lot of times people mistakenly attribute that to aging, you know, our sex life isn't what it used to be because we're older.
Mm.
And I'll say, well, maybe it isn't because you're older. Maybe it's because drinking does affect people sexually. And so if that's the case, you know, we talk about working together. How can we begin to rekindle that? That can be awkward for people, you know, if their sex life has kind of drifted off. When I bring up the sex life, they get uncomfortable. And I understand.
It's like relationship. You're
Right,
not only you supporting people with an addiction problem to varying degrees, but also you're going into relationship things that people may have hidden for a long time through their
right.
drinking.
Yeah, exactly. And the things that used to give them a pleasure together, I'd bring up things. Did you ever, what about taking a weekend off, taking a weekend away as a couple, or as a family, taking a weekend off as a family? Did that used to be part of your family life? Did that used to be once part of your relationship? And has that changed? And very often, again, the more the couple develops their relationship with drinking, the more drinking pushes out those other things. As you said before, your lifestyle comes to accommodate the
Mm.
drinking. And as it moves more and more to the drinking becomes more and more important. They may not make the connection, but that's my job to help them make the connection and then make a decision about what future do they want. Because I can predict that their relationship is not going to get better if they continue as a drinking couple.
Mm. And then sort of success rates, and I suppose success is different to different people.
Right.
But do you think people are more likely to be successful in becoming sober if they do it together? Or
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. Uh, Unfortunately, almost all the research that I've been involved in for 30 years has focused on individuals. And I've developed treatment programs which show that we can treat individuals successfully. However, we also know that there's a high relapse rate. there's a high relapse rate when we're working with individuals,
Mm.
okay? And, people in the treatment field like myself will have puzzles for a long time. Why do people relapse, okay? And why is it that they do? And what I'm discovering through sober love is that, yes, indeed, there's a much higher success rate if couples approach it together, if they're motivated to do it together. Now, of course, if they lose that motivation and one says, no, I'm not going to do it, uh, I think that if it's only one person in a couple who's willing to work on it, I think the chances of success are
Mm.
much less if they don't see it as something they both stand to gain from.
Mm.
So, yeah, there's not much research so far on it, but from my clinical experience and the examples in the book, I think there's a much higher success rate.
Definitely. And well, it sounds so obvious, doesn't it? If you're helping each other along the way
Right.
by doing it together. And I suppose if one person were to fall off and decide it's not for them, you then have got the problem that they will then be encouraging the other person, oh, just have one drink or whatever it might be. It's almost they might sort of flip the other way to make it even harder.
Correct. Correct. That's right. That's absolutely right. And so that's why I asked about the outset to give some serious thought and serious discussion with each other and with me about what they might gain uh, by loving their relationship.
Yeah.
Not only loving yourself, but what do you gain by loving that relationship, about trying to restore that relationship, even on what I call the spiritual level, which has to do with, what are your values? What brought you together? What kind of common values do you have in terms of the kind of life you want to live? Uh, how much do you value things like uh, the environment? How much do you value things um, like being involved in the community?
Mm.
Things like that. And that's part of what you might call your spiritual life, being involved in a community, being involved in nature. How much time did you ever spend in nature together? How much time did you ever spend visiting an art museum, going to a concert? Things that kind of move us spiritually. And
Mm.
so I asked them to that too, because very often they'll say, well, when we first got together, we did do those things, and now we don't do them anymore.
Mm.
So I
And
said, well, how can we rebuild that as well?
and do you sort of find that when people are sort of relapsing or you or is it just a question of reinforcing the groundwork? Because it sounds to me like it's really important to do the groundwork so that
Mhm.
they know they can remember if they're thinking of like, well, maybe maybe this isn't for us, but then they can automatically go back to what they had originally thought, the reasons they wanted to give
Yes,
up because they wanted to improve their relationship. They wanted to improve their family
yes,
life.
yes. I often ask them after I talk about making a decision about becoming a sober couple, I ask them to rate on a scale of 1 to 10 how committed they are to becoming a sober couple, each of them from a scale of 1 to 10, one being least, 10 being most. And if one says, well, I'm a 9, and one says I'm a 3, I said,
Yeah.
well, we need to talk about that more.
Yeah.
We need to talk about it more. I tried to get them up to both being like a 7, say, okay, about commitment to doing it.
Mm.
And I said, okay, that sounds good to me. But then I often bring it up again, you know, 2 or 3 sessions later when we're working on this. I said, well, tell me today, what's your commitment like today on a scale of 1 to 10? Are you still committed, at a level 7? Or is one of you beginning to doubt it? Is one of you beginning to doubt your commitment? And let's talk about this. It's very important to be honest about it, because if you're not honest about it, you're likely to slip. So I tell
Yeah.
people, look, sometimes commitment changes, varies. Maybe you're having second doubts. Maybe you're starting to think, well, maybe my partner needs to stop, but I don't. Let's talk about that again. So again, why are you feeling that way now? What do you stand to gain by making the commitment? So you're absolutely right. I think it's important to keep the commitment
Mm.
in focus.
And I would would say that it's maybe better to start off at a scale of 7, and then as things go on and it
Right,
improves, they suddenly realize their commitment is getting stronger. Because if your commitment's at 10 to start with,
right.
you're only going to go down. Whereas,
Well, yeah, to be very honest with you, very people start at 10, you know. You know, I'm inclined to be as skeptical if someone tells me they were 10.
yeah,
I often will say, well, I, I'll take that as your intention. Okay. I'll
yeah,
take that you're very well intended, but intention is different from all the work you're going to have to do to building a sober lifestyle. So I will accept that as your intention, but let's maybe make your commitment at maybe a 6 or a 7, because realizing that you've got a lot of hard work to do. You have a lot to gain, but
mm,
you also have work to do.
mm, absolutely. Joe, Dr. Joe, it has been a real pleasure to chat with you, and I think it's made me really think, and I do hope that a lot of people, really have a think about it, as not opposed to, I really need to give up drinking, but think about it. What are the things I've got to, have we got to gain from giving up together,
Right.
as a couple and as a family? And I think it's a different approach. And I would think it is something that gives people a lot of motivation or a lot of good reasons very quickly as to why they should give up drinking, as opposed to just the standard individual ones,
Right. Correct.
So I certainly wish you well with it. And I saw at the beginning there was a lovely forward from, it was at the former chief medical officer at the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation, and sort of saying that they were going to give it to everybody, which I think is a glowing testament.
Okay. Well, it's been a pleasure talking with you.
So thank you so much, and thank you.